Since the beginning of this podcast, almost 100 episodes ago, I have been mining my 30-year Superman fandom, starting with that tattered red cape, within the larger context of the character's rich 85-year mythology, examining, discovering, and reconsidering the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Now, our milestone 100th episode beckons, and the journey continues. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Electric Til 1 Million, Part 4. And joining me to discuss the JLA run by Grant Morrison and Howard Porter is returning guest, Ralph Puma. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me again. Really excited to dig into this one.
This is a big one. So in this Electric Til 1 Million event that we're doing, we're covering 97 through 99. And so Morrison and Porter's run, because I don't want to discount Howard Porter. He brought so much to the table in terms of bringing this run to life and sort of translating Morrison's vision for all of these crazy ideas into something that was just a beauty to behold. But anyway, this run started in 97 and wrapped in early 2000. So it really spans this entire period that we're talking about over these episodes. So I thought kind of midway through Electric Til 1 Million would be a perfect time to delve into it. And also because obviously we're coming off of a couple of episodes discussing Superman's journey as Electric Superman. And that gets a fair bit of play for a decent chunk of Morrison's run from issues 5 until about 20 or so. So we're with Electric Superman in this JLA run for a good bit.
Yeah, he does some cool stuff with it too that I will talk about. But I think that when you have this new version of a character, you're able to just kind of put anything into it. So it kind of had like this vibe when how he treated Electric Superman when he showed up is kind of like the old like 60s and 70s writers did, where they were like, oh, let's see, does this work for this character? And if it does, they'll drop it. I mean, if it does, they'll keep it, or if not, they'll drop it and never talk about that power again.
I think if you poll DC fans about Electric Superman, the consensus typically seems to be that folks prefer how Morrison treated him in JLA over the way the regular super titles were dealing with him at the time. So we'll talk about all of that. And just to lay this out for folks, what Ralph and I focused on, we reread the core JLA issues written by Grant Morrison. So there were, by my count, I think 8 fill-in issues by Mark Waid, Mark Miller, and J.M. DeMatteis. We skipped over those. They're great. I remember them very fondly, and we might touch on them in a future episode. But for this, we focused on the Morrison-written issues 1 through 41 of that JLA series. Now, if you're saying, hey, what about 1 million? Well, stay tuned, because in 2 weeks, we have an entire episode devoted to the DC 1 million event. So I think people will really enjoy that. And then I suppose one other big item in the Morrison JLA bibliography is the Earth 2 original graphic novel that Morrison wrote and Frank Quitely drew. And I have plans to cover that in a summer event that we're building towards. So I would just say stay tuned. And so I just want to mention that, because if anyone's like, hey, what about this? What about that? They will be covered. But that's kind of what we focused on for this. So we were talking off mic about this. As much as we'll do the typical deep dive analytical discussion that we always do and that hopefully the audience has come to expect and enjoy, this one, I think there's more of a personal component, because this run, you and I have talked about this, was so formative for both of us in ways similar and different. So let me toss it to you first, because, when this run came along in 97, I mean, I was already in comics. I was following all the Superman books. But for you, this was more or less your introduction to comics, right?
Yeah. I mean, prior to this, the only comics like I remember reading was like the Ben Reilly Spider-Man issue that my mom got at like a deli, and then the Green Lantern with Kyle Rayner. So like I had no introduction to like any of the originals. And like I think what got me into Green Lantern in the first place was walking around like the Cross County Mall and seeing like when they used to have all the action figures and comic books laid out for like the flea market times when they would do that in Cross County indoors. And I saw a Parallax figure and I was like, wait, why is Green Lantern evil? And then like from that point on I had to discover like why it all happened. And so shortly after, like, we started going to alternate, and then like this comic was it. Like, I remember every month I like needed to read this one the most out of anything, because I felt like it gave me the most information about as many characters as possible. And I think it was accessible. Like, reading it again, it's so accessible for kids as well. It's so like fun at times. It's, big concepts, but also in like manageable bites as well. And it never stops. I feel like this run is so relentless.
That's a good way of describing it. So you mentioned a couple of places. Cross County is this outdoor mall in Yonkers, New York, and there was a comic shop there for many years that I did go to. I suspect you did as well. Dragon's Den.
Dragon's Den. Yep.
Dragon's Den. And then you mentioned Alternate Realities, the comic book shop that we both worked at, and that's where we met. So did you start reading this from issue 1, or was it a little bit underway and you caught up? What happened?
Yeah, I definitely started reading this from issue 1. I would have to get a better timeline of like where everything came in for me, like when that happens. I know that I was reading Nightwing as well. I'm not sure if that Nightwing run had started right prior to this and Impulse. So I know that those two were ones that I was reading. But I remember like reading these like every morning before school, and then going into school and telling people like what had happened in them. And then like we'd play it out in the schoolyard, and like my action figures were all from this run. Like every like superhero action figure that I had was these ones. Like I had an Electric Superman, I had Kyle Rayner, and it was all like the Total Justice ones too, where they had like the armor and all of that.
I meant to look these up before we sat down to record, and the day just got away from me, but I don't need to look them up because, man, I remember those figures. You had that Kenner Total Justice line, and then there was a subsequent line from Kenner as well, but I remember those so fondly. And it's funny, I just did an episode of Summoning the Zords on the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, and I was talking to Ken Marion about it. I was like, man, I wish I had kept my Power Ranger toys in a box. Like, I could have looked at them now and talked about them on the episode. Same thing with those Kenner figures. I remember those so fondly. I think what was so cool about those was that they were the characters that were in play in the comics at the time, right? So it really just felt like, hey, you're reading these comics and now you have these figures based on it. And, I remember being a kid and coming up with my own stories with the action figures and stuff. And it was just, oh man, that was a great line. I remember
doing the same. Fondly. I remember my dad came into my room and I had arranged them all on my desk. I'd taken everything off of like my desk that I would work on for school stuff, and I arranged them all in a circle. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "They're having a meeting, Dad." Because what happens in these Justice League books is they're always around the table and discussing something at some point.
Yeah, this run was huge. I think that whether you're well versed in the DC mythology or a little bit more of a casual fan, this is a run that always comes up, that people know, that people recommend. And what's crazy is, I had not revisited this, with the exception of Rock of Ages, which you and I touched on in an episode we did a while back. We talked about Final Crisis and Rock of Ages. So I had reread that recently. But otherwise, man, probably like 20 years, 15 or 20 years since I went back to this. And look, it's always one of those things. I think we can all identify with this stuff that you love as a kid, and then you go back to it later, and sometimes it holds up and sometimes it doesn't. And maybe part of the reason sometimes where we don't go back to things is because we're worried about how we're going to perceive them. And you never want to have that feeling where it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I like this. I have to tell you, I had the best time going back and rereading this run, and it brought me right back. So like I said, I was reading the Superman. I've talked about this a million times, but I was reading the Superman books, starting in 92, right? And now I'm 5 years into my career as a comic book reader, fan, collector. Yeah. And I'm essentially just reading the Superman books, right? My mom didn't really want me reading comics, and it was sort of like one a week. And thankfully there was a Superman book a week, and that was kind of it. And then I remember seeing that JLA was coming out, and we probably talked about this in the other episode, but JLA 11, part 2 of Rock of Ages, with Luthor and Joker on the cover, and they've got Electric Superman and Martian Manhunter in that maze.
Yeah,
I'm almost positive that was the one that sealed the deal for me, and I was like, I have to pick this up. I have to get this. And I know I talked about this, but Brandon Montclair, who's now gone on to have this great career as a comic book writer, and he was an editor before that. He was one of the owners of Alternate Realities at the time. And I remember JLA number 10, the first part of Rock of Ages, had sold out, and he was able to track down a copy, sold it to me for $10. I'll always remember that.
What a guy.
And then I went back, and I think at that point, I was only able to nab issue 9 with the key, because I definitely have this memory of reading that part 2 of that key 2-parter in a vacuum and not really knowing what was going on, but still loving it, loving all the Connor Hawke stuff, and it was great. And then thankfully, and this was kind of new at the time, DC was putting out the trades fairly quickly. So I remember getting the trades for New World Order and American Dreams and catching up. And then, of course, I had all the single issues from Rock of Ages forward. And, so for me, this wasn't my introduction to comics necessarily, but it just opened up this whole new world, right? Like the Superman books were great, and I was all in on that. And I had met a lot of these characters, right, when they would guest star in the Superman books. But this was really the first time that I was just seeing the wider DC universe, and one of the best, purest, most epic displays of it, no less.
Yeah,
it was incredible.
I there's no way that this book can like bring in anybody to comics. You see why each character is good, and each character kind of has their moments throughout each of the books themselves, and then they'll even have like moments within like an arc for themselves. It captures why the Justice League is important, and it's like always defending itself. I feel like it's always like, this is why the Justice League exists. Like it's always the arc starts with, do we really need a Justice League? Do we need to be here? And then it always ends with like, no, this is why we are here.
It's very true. And as we get deeper into the run, there's all this talk about sort of what configuration of the league, what sort of structure, what sort of membership volume they need, right? And they have that whole recruitment drive, and they expand the roster as they're preparing for this threat that they've been tipped off about, which we'll talk about. But which of course is very reminiscent of Justice League Unlimited, right? The animated series where they expand their ranks and all of that. But yeah, there is a lot of discussion about their role and how they should go about it. What's funny is, I mean, I always think of this as my introduction to the Justice League, but of course it wasn't. Because technically, I met a Justice League in the Death of Superman storyline.
That's true.
But
are they really a Justice League?
That's the thing. Look, for any fans of that iteration of Justice League, that era of Justice League, if you love Fire, Ice, Booster Gold, Blue Beetle, Bloodwind, Maxima, awesome. That's great. That, to me, doesn't hold a candle, right, to the big 7 lineup that Morrison gave us. And of course, that would later expand, but really always revolving around that core 7. And I think that's why, as much as I had met a version of the Justice League before, it never really cemented in my mind, because this was, and again, I think even fans of those characters would agree, a lesser league, right? And I know in that title they got to, it delved more into humor, maybe more of the interpersonal relationships. Like, it was its own thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think I ever came out of that Death of Superman 90s era really feeling like I had an attachment to, or even a great sense of what the Justice League was. Because what was my exposure to them? They're the team that gets decimated and sort of necessitates Superman being that last line of defense. So it doesn't necessarily conjure a lot of attachment per se. So this is really what I consider my introduction to what I see the Justice League as.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the wrestling mentality. If you introduce a new wrestler and they're just getting beat all the time, you're not going to sell as many action figures of that wrestler. Like, it's the same thing. You create a character, and if they're, the foil to tragedy, a lot of people are not going to want to connect with that. They want to connect with the characters that like embody the best of things. And I think that we can maybe fit Aztec into that too, because I feel like Aztec is always kind of dropping the ball in this series a little bit. He's supposed to be this big figure, and like Grant Morrison and Mark Millar worked really hard on him, but at the same time, like, he's not. I remember not really caring about Aztec as a kid, and then reading through it again, I was like, oh, this makes sense of why I wouldn't when he's constantly like, you know, oh, he was bought out by Lex Luthor. Like,
Yeah, there's definitely that tragic element to this character where, he was, trained in this way and he thought he was preparing for this epic battle and everything. And then he finds out that, yeah, Lex Luthor was sort of behind everything, but there does end up being this big threat that he was
yeah.
preparing for. So there was that element of truth and he sacrifices himself. Did you ever read his 10-issue solo series?
I tried a few years back and I didn't continue it, but it is on my list because, big Grant Morrison fan. But for some reason, something about it just hasn't connected with me, even though I love like Aztec culture and like all that like South American history and lore. And so I have to keep trying. I'm going to try it at one point again I mean, it's in the app, I believe. I'm not sure though. So.
It is. Well, I'll give the DC app props for that. And everything
Yeah.
that we're talking about here, it's all in the app and all that, which is great. And yes, that Aztec series is there. I've like yourself, I've made a couple of attempts and I never got all the way there, but maybe at some point. But I guess I would be kind of curious to get more of a sense of what was going on with this character. He just kind of pops in and out of that JLA run. Has some key moments, but it would be interesting to know a little bit more about what was going on, kind of on
there
his
was
side.
some major guest stars too that I didn't realize were in this, and like now that I'm rereading it and they're characters that I love, I'm like, whoa, what? I was getting like excited seeing them pop in this time. So
who are some of the ones that really stood out to
you? Daniel from Sandman, like
Yeah.
had no concept of what Sandman was when I was a kid, nothing. But now that I've loved Sandman, seeing that was awesome. And then later on, Animal Man like kind of shows up and like sets everything in motion at one point near the end. Like he just kind of like walks in and is like takes care of business about like the lizard brain with I believe it was with Mageddon.
For sure. No, I have to say, I think what I was so struck by in rereading this, I mean, a few things. One was just the scope and scale of it, and this just it just felt big. It felt important. It felt like this book was kind of charting the course for the DC universe. It felt that way in rereading it, and then it also sort of brought me back to that time as a kid when I'm 10, 11, 12, 13, when I was first reading this run and kind of having that same feeling then. Like it just had this weight to it. So I was really struck by that. I appreciated all of the efforts to reflect what was going on in the characters' solo titles at the time. And I'm sure if someone were to sit down and try to sync everything up, I'm sure there's some discrepancies. But this was during the time where Wonder Woman, Diana, died in her title, and then her mother, Hippolyta, took over, and the books reflected that. There's an issue at the very beginning of Rock of Ages where Flash is out of commission. He's injured, right? He had broken his leg in his own title. That was reflected here. Obviously, all the Electric Superman stuff. In a couple of those Mark Waid fill-in issues, they deal with the no man's land of it all, which was going on in the Bat books at the time. So I very much appreciated that. I thought that was a nice touch. And I think one of the other big things was, I guess in my head, I don't know, maybe I was conflating the trade paperback, those, I know we've had different permutations of the collected editions. Now there are those, sort of the larger volumes that collect, a much bigger chunk. But going back to the first round of these collections, I guess I was always conflating maybe the titles of those trade paperbacks with, one continuous arc. So in my head, I was like, yeah, there's like, 4 or 5 big stories in this run. But going back, so many, they're like 2-parters, 3-parters, 4-parters. They're not these, massive sprawling epics. I mean, Rock of Ages and then World War III, those are each 6 parts. But other than that, again, 2-parters, 3-parters, 4-parters. And I really enjoyed the structure of it. And I thought there was a really nice balance there. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I genuinely loved the key, like, 2-parter. That was one that, like, I remember, like, every aspect of it, because I, like, remember rooting for Connor so much as, like, a kid that, like, even now, it's such a cool storyline, the entire Justice League is gone, and the guy who has no powers and isn't Batman is stuck with, like, these super-powered robots, and, this guy who apparently has unlocked 90% of his brain.
I'm glad you brought up Connor. We had touched on this off mic for a little bit, but this was one of the big things that I wanted to talk about, which is we get that beautiful showcase of Connor Hawke, right? Who at this point in the comics had succeeded his father, Oliver Queen, who had died and would be off the board for a while. So he was our Green Arrow. Of course, among the core 7 of the Justice League, we have Wally West as the Flash. We have Kyle Rayner as Green Lantern. Actually, pretty early into the run, I'd forgotten how early this was. We're introduced to the angel Zariel, who has decided to live on Earth and take on flesh and he's this winged character and Aquaman even mistakes him for Hawkman at one point, right? And I was just thinking about how in this run, really throughout, and we were talking off mic about how you can really look at Kyle Rayner, right, as kind of a through line here, a point of view character, and someone who really has an arc over the course of these 40 issues. And I look at this run and I'm like, man, Morrison was really moving the larger mythology forward, right? Yeah. Allowing these newer characters, those who had assumed the mantle of their predecessors, fairly recently, allowing them to grow and shine and have their moments. And again, a character like Zariel, like he's not the new Hawkman, but he's a winged character, right, in the DC universe, kind of filling that role, but in a very different capacity. And I just look at it and I'm like, that was such a great way, I think, to honor what came before, right? It's there, it's always sort of always in the shadow of those who had come before them, but moving it forward as well. And I mean, as a kid, in fairness, I didn't have the attachment to Hal Jordan. I didn't have the attachment to Barry Allen. Maybe I would have felt differently. I'm sure I would have felt differently if I did. Yeah. But as a kid, for me, it's like, man, I'm really like captivated by these characters and their journeys trying to forge their own path. And in the years after this run, we would get the return of Hal Jordan. We would get the return of Hawkman. We get the return of Barry Allen. And I liked a lot of those stories. I don't even necessarily begrudge DC for doing that, but I don't know. I look at this run in particular, this era, and I feel like I feel like, and I apologize for being so long-winded about this, but I just feel like, for anyone who's like, it was inevitable that those other characters would come back. I'm like, I don't know. Look at this run, look at this era, because I feel like this is something that, had DC really committed to this, could have continued. I mean, how do you feel?
Yeah, and I think that, the characters do find their ways to shine individually. What I think is, because even Wally was a major part of, recent issues in comics and things along those lines. And, Kyle is like the White Ranger, basically, of the DC universe. He's got all of the powers of all of the Lanterns as far as the last I read. But, what I think is a tragedy is I feel like Connor is missing. Like, I feel like he's completely missing from comics. I haven't seen him in anything recently, at least to my knowledge. Once again, I'm not all the way caught up yet, but I genuinely loved Connor. I think there was something cool about like this character who was, very meditative, and like I remember reading his entire Green Arrow run, and I remember being like, oh, so now we're switching away from him and it's going back to the old guy. Like, I remember being so disappointed by that, and I think that's still something that I like feel about it. But Oliver Queen is Oliver Queen. He's one of the most major. Did Connor even pop up in Arrow?
Yeah, they did a version of Connor Hawk when they did some future visits to the future. It wasn't particularly strong, was my memory of it.
But like, Connor's great. You have that moment where he's like looking around the city in destruction and he's like embodying Ollie, and you see like the older guys being like, oh, he's definitely his father's son. Like, there's great moments with him, and it's just a tragedy that character is missing, I feel.
Yeah, I'm not positive. I feel like they've done something with him recently, but I haven't kept up with it, so I'm not positive. Audience, please let us know. But even if he's getting some play, right, it's definitely not to the extent that of what we saw during this period of time.
Yeah.
And look, here we are, in our mid-30s. Like, this was a very formative time for you and I as we were reading, and these were the versions of the character that we first really met and connected with. So we feel a certain way about that, and I can certainly appreciate how, mutual friend Rich Roney, who's been on the show before, like, who grew up with Barry Allen and Hal Jordan, like, would, feel differently. Although he was a fan of the younger characters too, so he's maybe not even the best example. But that experience is such a big part of all of this, and I can appreciate that. But I guess I love the way Morrison handled these characters. And I mean, Connor Hawk in particular, because Connor's not a member of the team for very long here, right? It's sort of that he's coming to the Watchtower for his tryout during that key two-parter, and he just gets like launched into having to rescue the rest of the team. And then, of course, we see the future version of him and the present day version in Rock of Ages, and then he kind of steps away. So it's not like you get a ton of Connor, but you get enough. And it really, when he's wandering around the Watchtower, trying to figure out what to do, right? The big seven, or however many of them were in play at the moment, under the thrall of the key, trapped in this, this fantasy world. And he has to rely on his dad's trick arrows from the JLA trophy room. And in the end, of course, inevitably, it's the boxing glove arrow that saves the day, as the key is going on and on about how he's amassed all of the power he needs to access this other dimension, or whatever the case was. And all of a sudden, you just see that boxing glove arrow just clock him. It's great. It's such a great moment.
Much. And I love when before he's like, I don't even know if I can fire this thing. Like,
yeah, no,
it's so good.
Well, I know that's the funny thing. I've never tried my hand at archery, but I would imagine just sort of like the physics of it. I don't know how that would really work,
because it's got to be weighted. It can't just be like an empty boxing glove. It's got to have that like weight to it. So,
and we mentioned Kyle, and you mentioned Daniel Sandman, right? Who has a role in that two-parter with Starro. It's kind of a new take on Starro the Conqueror, where the whole country is placed in this slumber, and Starro's taking over through their dreams and all that, and Sandman has to help them. But there's this great moment between Kyle and Daniel where Daniel's like, you'll surpass him, the one who came before. And Kyle's like, well, Hal, like everyone's always talking about Hal, how great he was. Daniel's like, you'll surpass him because the one thing he could never learn, fear.
Yeah.
I get chills as I'm saying it.
It's so good. It's so good.
It's so good.
Another legacy character too. So having this legacy character that isn't Morpheus, but is, it's a little amorphous there, but being able to say that to another legacy character is also really cool.
For sure. And I think Kyle, like we said, I think Kyle has a great, it's funny when we talk about arcs. I mean, I think that when you're dealing with a team book, right? And virtually all of the characters have their own solo titles, or multiple titles in the case of Batman or Superman, right? Most of the main development is going to happen over there in their own titles. But I do think with Kyle in particular, when you go from him at the very beginning of this, where he's just so out of sorts and sort of wide-eyed and intimidated at the prospect of working with these legends, these icons, these living myths, to go from that to the moments that we see throughout the story, and culminating in that World War III storyline where, Mageddon has essentially messed with his ability to work the ring. And he just has this, this moment by himself, right? Where he's just like, come on, like get it together. And he's able to do it. He's able to muster the willpower he needs. And, he walks outside and he encounters Wally, and Wally's like, you're the Green Lantern, man. Like you look like Green Lantern. It's great. It's so good. And I know Kyle's continued in all of that, but I loved his role here.
And leading up to that moment too, when like Guy is there and he's like questioning him, and like, but he doesn't, his ring's not even working. And he's like, listen, you want the JLA? Look to the skies, because that's me. And like, it's so good. Like when I read that, I was like, yeah.
Yeah. Anytime Guy Gardner is put in his place, it's always a good time.
Absolutely.
You know what I had forgotten? I not that they're at each other's throats or anything, but there was more tension between Kyle and Wally than I remembered.
Right from the beginning, I feel like Kyle is almost like this like green like production assistant type at first. He's easily distracted. He's not sure what he's doing. He's like almost asking like too many questions. Like, no, just do the thing. Like, you're the Green Lantern. Do a Green Lantern thing. And that's kind of how everybody treats him at first. But then you also see this moment where like Superman's able to be vulnerable around Wally and Kyle, and Superman like confesses his doubts to them. And I think that's like incredibly helpful for them as well.
Absolutely. I think it's a moment between Superman and Flash, right? During that, the Zariel Asmodel two-parter where, he expresses to Wally sort of doubts, concerns about living up to this myth that everybody, sort of, projecting onto him. And then later in the story, as Wally says, like, he's literally wrestling an angel. He's like, this is the guy who was worried about living up to his own myth. It's great. It's so good.
It's so much fun. What do you feel about the HyperClan? So if we're going back to like the beginning of all of this, do you think that they are made intentionally forgettable, or like how do you feel about the HyperClan characters themselves? They kind of embody almost like these 90s like Rob Liefeld type characters that like came and went. And so I feel like it really is pitting the Justice League against these like 90s types.
Yes, I agree with that. I think it's more like you said, more pitting them against an idea or an ideal rather than specific characters that were meant to really remember, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I kept thinking about was the Authority. And now I know that we're still a couple of years away from the Authority, right? Because that was 98, 99?
Yeah.
Like it was after this, right?
As far as I know, I just started reading it. So I had never read the Authority prior to maybe 2 weeks ago.
I still have not read it yet, but now that they're one of the building blocks of the James Gunn cinematic universe, I will have to give it a try. And of course, I mean, I've heard, great things about it over all these years, but I did check. It was after this JLA run, but not long after. And I do kind of wonder, I mean, I guess to your point there, we were seeing kind of other versions of this, the extreme, the grim and gritty, maybe more proactive, more lethal heroes during this time. But as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think like, oh, like, was this in any way, shape or form kind of an inspiration for what we would get in the Authority? I mean, I have no idea, but that was definitely what came to mind when I was reading this.
Yeah, no, it has all of the vibes of those, like the boys characters and things along those lines of, I'm trying to think of what came before, like Rob Liefeld's like X-Force and like a lot of those Image Comics like characters, and even Wildstorm I think a little bit kind of fits into that mold of, even though DC and Wildstorm are connected, but the HyperClan just shows up as these, they execute the villains and like Joker's in hiding and things. It's wild, but at the same time I feel like they're forgettable themselves, like, and their names are kind of terrible as well.
They are. It's a great setup, though. And I wonder, I mean, I'm sure Morrison, whether they plan to do something themselves or we're setting it up for subsequent writers, in the culmination of all this. So, of course, again, for anyone who needs a refresher, right, we have this new super group, the HyperClan, who come and they set themselves up as Earth's new guardians, but far more proactive, right? They they convert the desert into this, lush farmland. Of course, later it's, kind of all a facade and it falls apart, but, they're doing that. They're executing criminals. Like, they're just far more proactive than any Justice League has been. And, very quickly seem to be turning public opinion against the Justice League. It turns out that they're white Martians, and it's a great reveal. And there are a lot of great moments kind of leading up to this. But in the end, we find out that the way that they're dealt with is, they are, I mean, essentially brainwashed and made to pose and live as humans. Yeah. And that will come up
dark. That's dark.
That's the thing. Like, it's and if my memory serves, and we'll actually get to this a little bit down the line in Mark Waid's run on JLA, which followed Morrison's. He followed up on all of this, and actually even in one of those issues, one of those fill-in issues during this period that we skipped, there's business with a white Martian posing as Bruce Wayne during a No Man's Land thing. So this was followed up on with the white Martians, but we'll talk about that more down the line. But it is a great setup. Like, the idea that these, it's almost like a ticking time bomb out there. It's like, especially with their telepathic mental abilities, it's like, well, this probably won't hold forever. But yes, the ethics of this are pretty questionable. And that's not really, it's not really delved into here. It's just kind of like, that's what's done with them.
Well, isn't also the ship that Prometheus finds, isn't it a white Martian ship in Tibet? Because it's like mentioned in passing that like this ship that he comes into contact with is also the white Martian. So it's like everything really does kind of come together in the ending right from this like very beginning point. Like, it all seems, pretty meticulously planned out.
That was one of the other big things, because again, all this culminates in that World War III arc, Morrison's final story, where they are facing the primordial annihilator, of the prior universe, the Mageddon. And there are hints and mentions of this from very early on. In fact, we didn't read this for this episode, but before JLA #1, Mark Waid wrote a 3-issue miniseries called JLA Midsummer's Nightmare.
Oh, I remember that.
And in that, there was a character who was warning of a coming warbringer and wanted to convert the human populace into superheroes. And the League stops him. I mean, ironically, that's how they'll win the day in the World War III storyline.
Yeah.
But so that this is, and they even mention that in World War III. One of the characters makes mention to that encounter from way back. So I mean, this was something like reading this, it's like, man, the pieces were really all in place. And again, other big picture take, this feels like a run, like really like a run in a way that not everything always does. Like sometimes, whatever, a writer loses interest, or they're not able to continue and bring their stories to fruition, whatever the case might be, or the quote unquote run just consists of maybe, more loosely connected arcs, but whatever the case may be. But this, I feel like these, 1 through 41, it's like there's really, you read this thing all the way through and you really get a complete story that clearly had a lot of intention and thought behind it throughout.
Well, I think Morrison in general, their work, they tend to really touch on the same themes because, I follow like their like online blog thing, the Xanadoom, and they sent out an article that was basically talking about the Ultra War is coming. And so it like just reading World War III, like at the end of this and seeing like, oh, this is what he means by Ultra War, is that everything gets heightened up to this level where everyone is at war with one another. And to always go back to these things. I mean, everything that happens in his future for the Justice League pretty much happens in Final Crisis. Like, and we talked about that. So they're really concise and like driven to get their themes across, because even their thesis on like how comic books and where the fifth world, basically looking in on the two-dimensional world of the comic books, that's all in this run as well.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that was so cool about this is that whether it's sort of the South American god of darkness that Aztec was trained to fight, or this, again, annihilator of the old world that Big Barda and Orion are sent to Earth to guard against, or this evil that Zariel and the heavenly hosts are aware of, right? It takes different forms and it's interpreted differently, right? But it's all the same evil that they must fight, just taking different forms. And so kind of regardless of what your perspective is, your belief system, like where you're coming from, it sort of fits into each of those. I really like that.
I mean, it's a very like occult idea, the god at the end of the universe that's eating it,
I feel like we had this exact conversation when we talked about Final Crisis.
Yep, exactly. It's out of the Bhagavad Gita. Like, so if you read like that, religious text, you'll see that, God in that reveals themselves as this world eater that's coming no matter what. It'll always be there, but it always starts anew afterwards. So it's just that, if you know that, it makes sense for a lot of Morrison's work, because they very much pull from the Gita when it comes to their larger mythological ideas, because the Hindu texts are massive. They are these superhero battles. In Hindi films, in like Bollywood films, they're able to make a connected universe with their deities that matches the Marvel universe. If you go look at some of these trailers for these Bollywood films, they're just as good as like an Avengers movie, but it's like they're gods. It's really cool.
Kind of on this note of Morrison and Morrison's big ideas and everything, I've always said, and I would still say this, even though I think I've come to understand and wrap my head around other Morrison works in a way that I didn't before, but even still, I would still hold this up as one of Morrison's most digestible superhero works, or just comic book works in general. So I was curious if you agree with that. And then also, your thoughts on Howard Porter as artist on here, because that's one of the other things that I found is that, you do need the right artist with Morrison to really sort of be able to translate a lot of these ideas. So how did you feel about the art here?
Um, I genuinely like Porter's work. I think it's very kind of pulpy, some of the way the figures move, and very dramatic. Like they're always making very big faces to convey emotion. But it's also every issue is these characters' worst day. Like there's not like a like chill moment. The only like laid back moment I can think of is the coffee shop scene with Ollie and Kyle. I mean Ollie with Connor and Kyle. That's like the only scene I can think of that's like very like, you know, character developmenty, dialogue heavy between two people with not a lot of action. Outside of that, every moment is like crisis, to the point where he's like stacking crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis, and it's kind of like, well, when are we going to get a break here?
It is. I think, as you said earlier, it is pretty relentless. It's funny. I think in some of those fill-in issues that we skipped over, I think you get a little bit more of the, my memory of it is, I think maybe you get a little bit more of those breather moments. But yeah, certainly in the Morrison written issues, it's just we're going from big story to big story, but I think that that pace, it works.
It works, and I think Porter was able to deliver on like the massive scale of these things. Like nothing was ever unclear with Porter's artwork. I think the character work is a little like cartoony almost, which I think works for kids. It's not this heavy realistic stuff. You feel like you're reading a comic book.
Yes. Yeah, I've always felt it's funny because I was, before we sat down to do this, I was just searching on Twitter, just curious, like what's been said about this run recently, especially kind of in my circles and stuff. And, one of the things that I saw someone ask, well, was Howard Porter the right artist? And it seemed like most of the people, were in agreement that he was. And I certainly am. And it's, to me, his rendition of these characters and these stories is so indelible when I think of this run. I mean, it's so much imagery that it just immediately comes to mind. And yeah, I think he really did a great job of presenting a lot of these big, wild, crazy ideas in a way that was clean and clear and palatable. And yes, to your points, like you still feel like you're in superhero comic mode, but there's something else going on here. And kind of on that note, I know, we don't have to put one thing down to lift something else up. At the same time, the context of all of this, as the audience knows, right? I've been rereading the Superman titles from this same period. And, I've been talking about the good and the bad as we've been going through it. Overall, I've been enjoying them, and I always appreciate the work that those creative teams on those Triangle era books were doing and weaving together a weekly story. And even the worst of those stories was still solid and entertaining and enjoyable. At the same time, I mean, you have to recognize what Morrison was doing here, and it's just they're playing on a different level, right? And that's the thing is, and I think that's why I'm not saying anything revolutionary here, but I think that's also why this run has withstood the test of time and stood out at the time as well. It's just that I think what they were doing was different than what we were seeing, even among the stronger superhero books at the time. Like this just felt elevated.
Well, you have with Morrison's career, and I'm sure I'm probably going to get something incorrect, but they had done Arkham Asylum, they had done Animal Man, they had done Doom Patrol, and they were kind of in the midst of the Invisibles. But you could tell that Morrison's kind of getting out their own doubts and fears through Kyle and Wally, that they were able to kind of use those two characters to like, oh, I guess we're in the big leagues now. Like, they may be one of the most prolific comic book writers now, but to be handed the Justice League when you're, a kid from Scotland, that Superman was the one who like made you stop fearing the bomb in the first place, to now be able to handle not only just Superman, but the entire Justice League, and to have the responsibility of developing these legacy characters further, and to be laying out the groundwork for everything in the DC universe up to Final Crisis. It's a big ask, and you can feel like I feel like when I was reading it, I can feel like their inexperience coming into terms, and like they're also on the same journey as Kyle in a sense.
Oh, that's a cool way to look at that. And yeah, I think there probably is something to that. And, the other thing too is that, props to Morrison and Porter, but, for giving us this version of the Justice League, right? I mean, I don't purport to be an expert on the history of the Justice League, but obviously I know we've had different permutations in membership. I know we definitely had stretches pre-crisis where Superman and Batman, like you had the heavier hitters on the team. And I think there was typically more of a mix where you had some of the heavy hitters and then some of the, second or third tier characters, right? So you had a little bit more of a balance. And then, of course, post-crisis, the Keith Giffen, J.M. DeMatteis, the Bwahaha era and the Death of Superman period, like all that stuff that we've been talking about, you as much as Superman I know was part of it for a time, but, it wasn't the big seven. And that's what Morrison gave us. And it's like, I'm sure it would have been an easier lift, right? To maybe not have all seven or whatever the case may be. But this just kind of escalated everything and the stakes felt higher. I mean, and it also felt perfectly fitting as well in its own way, right? It's like if you're going to have an assembling of superheroes in the DC universe to handle the biggest threats, well, I mean, it stands to reason it would be your heaviest hitting characters.
Yeah. I mean, and they also embody all of the major religions in this too. He's able to get all of these religions to kind of communicate with each other and like find common ground against like this existential threat of entropy,
Yeah, for sure. And I got to give props too, because as much as I've read a ton of Batman, obviously a ton of Superman, I've read my fair share of Wonder Woman and Flash and Green Lantern. Martian Manhunter hasn't had a ton of play in terms of a solo series. I know there was one, kind of around this time. I only ever dabbled in it. And I've read shockingly little Aquaman. I mean, I've really mostly just read that Jeff Johns, New 52 run. So, in a lot of ways, and especially at this time, this book's take on Manhunter and Aquaman in particular were very formative. And I feel like the book treats both of them very well, but Aquaman in particular, the character who is always easy to sort of dismiss or reduce to a joke, man, this series gives him so many badass moments. Yeah. It's like, I mean, there's so many to choose from, but like when, they have their expanded membership and they're inviting the press to the moon and Prometheus attacks and there's the fire in the greenhouse that's producing their oxygen, and they need the water from Aquaman's tank. And they realize that he's manually turning that thing. And it's like, I mean, it's great. And there's so many moments like that.
And then he takes on that massive like whale to creature and like the future. And I wish there was more of this because I loved it so much. Just the sarcastic dolphins in early on with like the Hyper Clan. I forget what they say exactly. Oh, ugly thing anyway. like, like I love that the animals like talked back to him in that moment, and I would just love more of that. Like I know it's silly, but I think it was just fascinating that they just you could hear their opinions about things and that they were working with him as like an equal almost.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there's so many great moments, and while we're talking about kind of versions of the JLA that came before, in thinking about the runs that would come later. And I mean, I feel like the Mark Waid run and then the Joe Kelly run, I will be going back to those fairly soon, but my memory of them is that they, felt of a piece with what had come before. They were, as they kind of were passing the baton to each other. But in runs to follow, I'm a big fan of Brad Meltzer, and I enjoyed his work on the post Infinite Crisis Justice League of America series that he wrote the first year of, the Tornado's Path and all that. But
oh yeah,
it's great stuff. But here's an instance where someone clearly had a ton of love for the Bronze Age, Justice League of America, and then was sort of giving us an updated spin on that. More recently, Scott Snyder had a long run on Justice League. I have not read it yet. I will be. But from what I know of it, it seems that Snyder's, affinity for the Super Friends cartoon was kind of on full display there with the Legion of Doom and all that. I don't say this as a knock, right? It's totally understandable and it's cool, right? You have the opportunity to write these characters. Of course, you're going to kind of call back to, what you love most about them, right? And bring them. But at the same time, there is this part of me that's like, well, is it like a one step forward, two steps back sort of thing? And I look at what Morrison was doing, and it just, and I know I said this before, but kind of in a different vein, it just felt like forward movement in a way that, I don't know. An audience, tell me if I'm wrong here, but like, have we had a run since that felt as forward moving, forward thinking as this? Or is it more, again, updated spins on familiar iterations?
Well, you can also say that this run was a callback to a lot of things. So the DC universe is constantly in this state of death and rebirth, and they change the characters and everything happens. You could technically tell all the same stories over and over again from every death and every rebirth. You have the key is basically I'm blanking on the plant, but you were talking about it in one of the Superman episodes that they put on the characters that
the Black Mercy.
The Black Mercy. And like, they don't tell you what the synthesized virus that he's injecting is, but it could just be like an LSD form of Black Mercy that now has put all of these characters into that state. You're retelling these like major Justice League moments. You have the Key, who's now updated. You have
Starro.
The Starro. You have the Justice League JSA combination. You're doing all like the pop hits, but just they're done so well and in such a way that covers them up as these like popular hits. It's like a whole new version.
Yeah, I guess that's no, because you're right. Yeah, on the one hand, maybe I'm giving Morrison too much credit because there was you're not wrong, but I don't know. Yeah, it still just had that feel of being fresh and new and different in a way that. But look, here's the other thing too that I very much recognize. It was new to me at the time.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well. So,
but these stories are new to somebody every time, and the people who have came before us, they may have seen these stories already, or maybe they hadn't. But I think what was the most new was having this team that was half original, half legacy characters. I don't think that had ever existed before. You had the run that was all legacy characters with the Justice League International lineup pretty much, but prior to that it's kind of always been the Super Friends.
Yeah.
So having these legacy characters really is what gave it that. And I think that's why legacy characters are important, because, hearing all the stuff that you're talking about with, Jonathan Kent and Superman, like, that's exciting to me. Like,
yes. Yeah, no, that has been so refreshing to read all of that. And yeah, again, I don't want to harp on this, but with Kyle, with Wally, with Connor, it wasn't as if, the entire DC Universe's slate was wiped clean and we had, the legacy characters. It was, you had this mix, right? And the JLA title is a perfect example of sort of all of that coming together. And again, in all of those cases, those characters, their storylines, their individual series were informed by what had come before. So I really, as I was reading as a kid, and even though my frame of reference was more limited, I always had the sense of what had come before. And so again, I just think it was kind of a nice way to go about it. I want to bring in one of our patron questions. So, and this ties us back to Superman and the Electric Saga, and then we can sort of continue to make our way through the big stories here. So Brian says, do you think it was the right choice to pivot into using Electric Superman in the run, or would you have preferred the classic look? When you reread the issues, did you look to see or pick up on points where the story was written for Superman, but we ended up with Electric Superman? I always felt the scene where Superman is pushing the moon was originally intended to be a show of super strength, not magnetic style, especially when the League looks on in awe. So, a couple of things to unpack there. As far as whether it was the right choice to use Electric Superman in the run, I say yes. As we said before, I think we get some of the best uses of Electric Superman in this run, so I would hate to lose those. And also, like I was saying before, And I think this can can be a fool's errand if you do it too much, right? Trying to reflect what's going on in the ongoing titles. Like you could drive yourself crazy, as the writer of JLA, if you're like constantly trying to make sure that you're lining up with every single thing. But I think when you're talking about with Superman, for example, a major change in his status quo, in his costume and in his power set, which lasted a full year, like a full calendar year, I think to ignore it completely would probably, might have made JLA feel like it wasn't as central to the DCU as we've been talking about, right? It might have been easier to kind of overlook it. Or what do you think?
I was honestly disappointed when I saw him back as normal. I was like, "Ah, man, he's back!" Like, I I love Superman, and I love what Morrison's able to do with Superman, but something about Electric Superman in this run, like he just kind of fits color scheme wise. His outfit is so like, I think the outfit's really cool. I know a lot of people disagree, but I genuinely think that outfit is like a cool take on this character that fits with this kind of cool legacy run. Like he doesn't have to, Superman isn't trying to fit in with these young characters. He's like, hey guys, I'm also kind of trying to figure this stuff out too. And so you have this like legend with these newbies, that this legend is also in the same spot that they are. So it makes them all feel like a cohesive team. And when he comes back later on, it's Superman again. And it doesn't feel as exciting to me when I saw, the red and blue versus that, blue and white, and like to know how he was going to have to handle things differently. Because at one point I'd think that he had to wear like a mask in space, but then they dropped that. So I don't know, like if something was developed in Superman over that, but you notice things like that where you're like, oh, wait. So how, because I feel like during this time period, you're very much always on like edge of like, how do his powers work? Like, who is he? And I know that that's, sometimes annoying for people, but I genuinely loved like him polarizing the moon and being able to like levitate it back. I thought that was so cool. And the amount of times he's like, oh, they're light energy, I'm made out of energy, absorbed. Like,
exactly. And, the one other big moment that comes to mind, we talked about him, wrestling the angel, polarizing and moving the moon, absorbing the hard light hologram Superman from the Revenge Squad, and just how sort of matter of fact he is about it. He's like, well, they're light. That's a form of energy. I absorb energy. Boom. And then even when Superman and Jean are on the decoy Injustice Gang satellite and it blows up, and he absorbs all of the energy except the light energy. So it still has the effect of the explosion, right? Yeah. And Luthor thinks that they're dead, but of course they're not. So I'm definitely glad that Morrison used Electric Superman. And I agree with you, man. It was weird. Like, as I was reading this, I get what you're saying. When classic red and blue Superman showed back up, I was like, okay. But there was something really cool. I agree. I think the living myth Big Seven version of the JLA, like having Electric Superman there, visually and again in terms of characterization and what he was doing, it just fit. It just worked really well. I'll also say, and this kind of ties back to a couple of episodes ago, I've gone on about how as we got deeper into the Triangle era Electric Superman storyline in the regular Superman books, it grew tedious for me how many times Superman was explaining to himself via thought bubbles, but essentially explaining to the audience like what he was doing with his new powers.
Yeah.
And I understand it's like, they want to make sure the audience understands. And also so much of why they did this story was, we want to challenge him in a new way. Now he's going to have to figure out new ways of doing things. And there were a few examples in those regular super titles where I felt, okay, like that was really a cool set piece where you got to see the new powers. But more often than not, it was just like, oh my God, it was just like we were constantly being told what he was doing. What was awesome here was that, again, I feel like he was just more matter of fact about it. And maybe because he's part of an ensemble here, he can have other people, to Brian's point, react in awe and explain what he's doing.
Yeah.
as opposed to Superman having to think what he's, you know what I mean? Like it has a much, much more, effective impact for me in that regard.
I downloaded this all really quickly, so I'm forgetting like where exactly this happens. But when they turn him into FM energy and just launch him into space at one point, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, I bounced off a satellite off of Jupiter."
Yeah.
It kind of gives an excuse for to have that old like comic booky like the heroes describing every action, and he's the only one that's doing it. It's just very funny. It's very that element of the explanation is very old style Silver Age kind of comic books.
No, absolutely. And, to Brian's other question about whether certain things were intended for classic Superman and then they had to quickly kind of shoehorn Electric Superman in, I really couldn't say. I mean, I don't think that anyone internally at DC was blindsided by Electric Superman. This was something they were building towards. So I would imagine that Morrison had enough heads up in order to be able to account for this. I could be totally wrong, but Morrison has Superman move the moon early. I mean, that's issue 6 or 7. I mean, it's very early on. And while, yes, maybe you could foresee a scenario where it had been classic Red and Blue Superman pushing the moon, I don't know. I really feel like this was more designed for Electric Superman. And I don't know that it would have necessarily had the same impact otherwise.
I didn't notice anything. I didn't notice anything that was like meant to be, regular Superman that ended up being electric. I think it all flowed kind of seamlessly. He shows up and he explains like, well, this is who I am. What was it? The haircut. That's the reveal when Kyle's like, all I did was tell him to get a haircut. I didn't know. I think he would change everything this much.
And I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at the JLA Secret Files and Origins #1.
Yeah.
So there's a short story in there where he insists on trying out for the League again because he has the new powers. Do you remember the button to that? Because it's a great payoff with Batman.
Oh, I missed it.
With Batman, where the League is updating.
Yes, yeah. And he's like, "No, it's Superman. Why are you bothering me with this?"
Yeah, it was great. No, the handling of Electric Superman, I think, was really strong, and yeah, I think even for people who really don't like this chapter in Superman's history, this was a bright spot, and I really think it does work for all the reasons that that we've been talking about here. So, yeah, I was really a big fan of that. So now, I guess circling back to the specific arcs, we just passed the hour mark, so it's like let's arc #1, HyperClan. I mean, I mean, you already hit it. Is there anything else specifically with that first arc that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think that there's anything major. I thought it was cool that you had like this, the faux altruism, the anti-propaganda works every time. The hate the JLA and Golden Oldies radio station was something that I thought was like interesting, that they were so quickly like, all right, we got to get our propaganda running to like get these people to turn against the JLA. And like, I think Aquaman and Wonder Woman are always great to have moments together, and they had this really great like, Arthur, stop posturing, like just it's me. And the flower of wrath, whatever that was terrifying. That like imperial death machine that they built with all of like the needles and screens. And I also felt like Batman had to work a little to earn his place in this. You had to kind of, Batman had his time to shine, to like, why is Batman here in the Justice League with all these heavy hitters? And he had his moment during this HyperClan run to kind of prove that.
Yeah, I mean, he's the one who figures out that they're white Martians. They're vulnerable to flame, right? When the bat plane goes down, like they don't want to go investigate because they don't want to get near the flames. And he starts to piece it together, and they discount him, right? Because he's the only one without powers. And then he's the one who's able to infiltrate and overtake them. And he leaves the note, right, on one of them, like, I know who you are. I mean, I feel like, you would know this better than me, but I feel like one of the things that's said about this run, I think more in the realm of a criticism, is this idea of the Bat God, like how Morrison builds up Batman so much and has him do all of these things, maybe to your point of, kind of, Batman proving himself. I In rereading this, and I might have totally misinterpreted that whole argument, but that's kind of, I don't know, kind of the sense that I've gotten. Have you come across that or no?
No, I don't think that Batman does anything too crazy in this one. It's not like he's falling from, you know, orbit and has to survive like in more recent things I've heard about. But like, I think that everything is kind of within a mortal's realm of capability at like a heightened stage. um I've heard Morrison talk about how Batman is kind of representative of the underworld deities, like a Hades in a sense. Like he is kind of this caretaker of the lost souls with Arkham Asylum, and like, you know, Gotham City is like his realm, that like dark realm that people don't want to go to, of like lost souls. And so that's kind of why he fits into this godlike thing, I would say, is because he's kind of embodying this like outsider, you know, caretaker of mortal souls.
No, fair. Well said. And I mean, I guess my feeling in rereading this whole run was, I feel like in most of these stories, like we talked about how big and epic and high stakes, how high the stakes are and everything. And I feel like in almost all of these stories, the League is always kind of scattered and against the ropes, but they always have, an ace up their sleeve. Like there's always some plan that they've formulated, something that they've worked out. And sometimes it's Batman, but other times it's not. I mean, Plastic Man and Steel have some great bits, especially in World War III, where they are able to, overtake Queen Bee and all that. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily limited to Batman. So yeah, I don't know. To whatever extent that's been an argument, it wasn't something that took me out of it, I guess I should say, as I was reading this.
I would feel the only criticism that I genuinely have on this book is kind of the lack of women in it, and how like in every issue there always seems to be like one off comment about someone, like a woman, like, oh, check out her in that swimsuit. Like there's always seems to be like one of those lines throughout each of these. But that would be genuinely the only criticism that I have of these books. But that's of the time, I guess.
Yeah, in fairness, and at least we do get the roster expanded. You get Huntress, you get Barda in there.
Yeah. And that's a breath of fresh air, because I love Barda so much. And even though I didn't realize, for me, I always thought that Orion and Barda were around so much more. And they even comment like, where are you? I forget who says it to them, but like I think it might be Steel, and Steel's like, where are you guys?
Yeah. No, I had that same thought too. It's like, as they're dispatched to Earth, and then they only kind of pop in here and there. They're not as regular a presence as we would probably remember them being. There's this one-off with Tomorrow Woman, this android,
so good,
created by Tio Morrow and Ivo, and the payoff to that I thought was terrific, where she is able to sort of break through her programming. Like she was programmed so well, too well, right, that she was able to gain this self-awareness and again sort of overcome this programming, develop a true moral code, and it was Tio Morrow, right, who had created
yeah,
her.
I mean, it's exactly the plot of Ex Machina. It's like, because you can see Morrow's excited that she's breaking the programming, even though Ivo, which I don't remember Ivo being a monster like that. Maybe it was something of that time period.
Yeah, but that I don't know.
But you could see Tio Morrow's like so excited that she like broke her programming. He's like, I did it. I created a soul.
And that to me, that was a payoff that just worked so well with this, right? That he was so like, that was his objective. Like he wanted to prove that he could do that. Like clearly, they don't accomplish their super villain aims, but he proved that he could do it. So I thought that was a nice payoff. And that issue is bookended with funerals, right, in this superhero cemetery, beginning with Metamorpho and then ending with Tomorrow Woman, and Superman's there for both. And I thought that was a nice one-off.
Well, they have that the caretaker basically saying, that Superman killed death in a sense, like he killed the concept of dying.
There's you know what? I feel like it's Final Crisis, where Jean is killed. and
Yeah.
there's some sort of service for him. And in that, they say, like, we pray for a resurrection.
Oh, that's cool.
I feel like it's final. I mean, I could be. I mean, you know, a lot of stuff is swirling around. I could be wrong, but there's some story, and I think it's Final Crisis. But it's like that makes sense, right? In the DC universe,
Yeah.
that they probably wouldn't see death as being that permanent within the superhero community, since we've seen so many people come back. So that,
Yeah.
you know, that tracks. You know, then we get that two-parter that introduces Zariel. I will say, I always love the character. I forgot how. I don't know what the right word is. I guess I always, in my head, remembered him being more, you know, more stoic, or
Same.
more serious, and he's not. Like, he's pretty flip, and I was like, oh, okay. I was just surprised. Like, I've totally misremembered his characterization.
Same. I don't know why I did that, because I remember him also being very stoic, and I remember him being one of my favorites. And this time around, I don't think he sat at the top of my like favorite list like I did when I was a kid. And I wonder, like, if Morrison put this in because of popularity from, what was that Nick Cage movie, The City of Angels, or where the
Oh.
angel comes down and like takes on flesh because of love.
Maybe. Did you ever read the Zariel 3-issue miniseries that Mark
I
Miller wrote?
did,
Yeah.
but I don't remember it. But
Same.
maybe that's where I got that from.
No, because I think that miniseries, that's on the app. Oh, well, I'll hit on that at some point. But so after he's introduced, right, he turns down membership in the league initially because he's like, I've fallen in love. And so I think the miniseries, it's just a 3-parter, follows that thread. But I think the characterization is consistent. I will say, what made me even more primed to enjoy the angels of it all is watching 15 years of Supernatural. Because what you learn in watching Supernatural is that angels are dicks, and God is at best an absentee father, at best.
Yeah.
And in fact, actually can get quite worse. So in watching this, right, where the angels are hunting him, and they follow him to Earth, and then they're destroying everything, I'm like, that makes sense. And I feel like as a kid, like I've talked about how I'm not religious now. I was more so as a kid. Like I went through Catholic school, all through elementary school, high school. There was a period in my life where I was more into it. And so I probably did view this, not that I would have been like, this is sacrilege, but I probably did view it differently at that point in my life. Whereas now I'm like, yep, that totally tracks based on what I've learned from Sam and Dean Winchester. Like this is exactly how it would go.
Yeah. I think that's why I liked Zoriel so much, because he was like, no, I'm like, I believe in humanity. Whereas like all the other angels are like, why do we have to deal with these things?
And just to skip to the end, but this is actually, you know, as we're kind of going through these arcs, when there are connection points, like, you know, we can jump around.
Yeah.
In that World War III storyline, he dies on the Watchtower when one of Luther's bombs goes off, and he finds himself in heaven, and he finds the heavenly hosts designing a new universe, right?
Yeah.
They've already written off this one. It's like Mageddon's coming. That's it. We're going to create this new one. And he appeals to them, and it seems like his words fall on deaf ears. And then you get the few of them who are like, I'll go with you. I'll come to Earth.
That Spartacus moment.
Yeah. And the as Michael Scott says, you know, Spartacus, classic whodunit. Still don't know who the real Spartacus is. But yeah, I mean, it is this great moment, and they really help turn the tide, right? As we're in this Mageddon arc, and everyone is just antagonistic and violent, and wars are breaking out, and the angels really help calm everything and calm the world leaders, and get everyone to sort of ease off. But it's a great, that's a great payoff, I think, for him, and to have that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And who says, I think it's maybe Barda who says the line like, after all your world leaders are being held hostage at Spear Point by the angels. And I like these people.
Yeah. I think Barda and Zariel, they have a moment at the end of 1 Million. It's a very brief moment where they sort of acknowledge to each other, like, hey, I know why you're here. And it's like, oh, yeah, I know why you're here. They, you know, they sort of acknowledge this larger threat that they both know is coming.
Yeah.
So.
And like Zariel's this perfect, you know, biblical Christian foil to the pagan gods of the JLA. You know, he's right there along with them, and they can exist all in the same place and work together. What a concept.
Yeah, very true. No, I do like this whole. I remember being very intrigued by this as a kid. Again, especially at a time where I was more practicing my faith. Sort of this notion that Christianity or like existed within the context of the DC universe, right? That there was the presence and the angels and all of that. It was interesting. I don't know that this character. I was looking him up on Wikipedia, Zoriel. Like he's popped up here and there. Like he'll pop up during big events and stuff, but I don't think anything's really been done with him in a substantive way. In a really
Not since Day of Judgment. That was really his big time to shine.
Yeah.
I feel like, but much like Connor, he's always in the background of big splash pages, and that's kind of where he's been relegated. And I'll be excited. I'll be like, "Oh, look, it's Zariel," and like someone remembered him. But that's about it.
Yeah. So we talked about that two-parter with the key. Such a great spotlight for Connor Hawke. Was there anything else there before we launch into Rock of Ages?
I just think that there was a moment with Kyle where he's always just proving, at least to me, why he's so much better than Hal, instead of just like, airplanes and, guns and things like that, where like Kyle's able to utilize the ring to like escape traps and to like use it as a way to develop, things that actually work. He traps himself in his own mind in the next arc in, Rock of Ages. He like ends up like in like a poppy field and during his hero's like mythic Dante's Inferno walk into the hell realm basically, and he creates his own mind that he's trapped in for months, he says, and something like that happens in Zariel's run. And I didn't write down the specifics, but I was just like, I just wrote down Kyle always showing how he's a much better character than Hal. Not that I'm putting down Hal, I just genuinely feel that Kyle is like a better Green Lantern.
Also, hot take, and I know the Hal fans will not agree with this, but Hal's arc, right? Rebelling against the Guardians when they won't let him rebuild Coast City, his descent into villainy, his ultimate redemption in Final Crisis, and then his new path as the Spectre.
Yeah.
That's a great arc.
It's amazing. It's like that. Without any of that, I would have been so upset that he came back as Green Lantern. Without the whole Spectre, without the Day of Judgment, with like that end piece where it's like him that they find in like the afterlife, and he's like, I don't know if I should. I don't forgive myself yet. And then he gets offered the Spectre. Amazing. It's so amazing.
And this might be its own episode down the line, but it's like what's crazy about this is it's not like, oh, this all happened within one writer's run. Oh, so much of Hal's arc happened over these big events, right? Final Night, 0 Hour, Final Night, Day of Judgment. But you put it all together, and again, I think it's a great arc, and it makes sense. Anyway, I'm a Kyle fan. There's Hal stuff that I've enjoyed, and I get the appeal of Hal Jordan, especially for those who grew up with him, or even if you didn't. I get it, but yeah, Kyle. My heart is always with Kyle. My heart is always with Kyle. Is I guess what it comes down to. But so Rock of Ages, obviously, we did a whole episode where we talked about that and Final Crisis. But yeah, I don't know. Is there anything that stood out to you like differently this time? Is there anything that you wanted to talk about?
I think it was around issue 10 I wrote down like this is about the time I realized that it's relentless. Like that's I know I've said it multiple times this episode already, but like it is truly a relentless run. They like in this Rock of Ages, coming off of like having fought angels and the key and all of these other things, they have the Injustice Gang and then stack on top of it Darkseid, and then stack on top of it Mageddon, and it's like it's a huge centerpiece. I mean, like Rock of Ages is truly a brilliant run. I think like what comes after it is almost like tame in comparison to anything that Rock of Ages like. No, it's almost like that Dexter season 4. You can't live up to that again. Not that it like ruins the rest of the run, but like it's just such a beautiful set piece.
I'm with you. So, what comes after this, which we'll talk about, we get the Prometheus two-parter, the Sandman two-parter, the Ultramarine Corps three-parter, the Crisis Times 5 four-parter with the JSA, which that's a standout for me because I love the JSA, and that was my introduction to those characters for the most part. And then the six-part, finale, World War III. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think it's one of those things. If someone said, like, what's the one arc from this run? Like, I can't read the whole thing. I can't read 40 issues. What's the one arc that I have to read? You would give them Rock of Ages.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. I mean, it really encapsulates, I think, probably the best of this entire run. So what I loved about this, especially upon reread, and especially in conjunction with World War III, it delights me to no end. First of all, we talk about these great treatments of all of the characters, but especially Aquaman and Martian Manhunter. Lex Luthor, too. I mean, I love the way Morrison handles Lex. And, this is, what a weird time in the Superman books, and he has recently returned to prominence in the super titles, right? He had made the deal with Neron in Underworld Unleashed, and that rejuvenated the cloned body that he had been living in, posing as his own son. Yeah. So now he's back as Lex Luthor. And, like, right before this, in the Superman books, he was able to beat all of the charges against him in court. He had this whole ploy where they wheeled in a Lex Luthor clone, this degenerating, cackling madman of a clone, and pinned everything on the clone. And Lex was off scot-free. And in a nice bit of synergy, there was one of the issues that I think we covered in a prior episode where Lex says, like, oh, I've got to go see about destroying the JLA, and it's like, see upcoming issues of JLA. So there was a nice little bit of synergy there.
That's
awesome. I love the treatment of Lex. I love this whole idea of attacking the JLA as if you were performing a corporate takeover.
Yep.
And then, of course, the Batman of it all, where Batman's like, well, he doesn't know that he's going up against someone who's better at corporate takeovers than he is, Bruce Wayne.
Yeah. But
the thing that just tickles me is how both here in Rock of Ages and then later in World War III, what like in any other run, what would be the centerpiece of each arc, the Injustice Gang, like in both instances, like they're just overshadowed by the dark side of it all, and then by the Mageddon of it all. It's like it's crazy. Like, that's just how big. And to keep going back to this word relentless, just like how big this run is, where even when you're dealing with the Injustice Gang, it's like they're just sort of, I don't know, more of a hindrance or an inconvenience. Like, there are far larger forces at play. And I just love that Lex keeps picking the worst time to do all this stuff.
There's right at the beginning of Rock of Ages, Connor's sitting with Kyle and at the diner, and he goes, yeah, like, I don't even know how good I'm going to be up against someone like, Darkseid. And like, it's proven by the end of this arc, just like perfect synergy between, front and back end of these issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And the Flash's other line of like, guys, it's getting cosmic here. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that. Like,
I know. It's great stuff. I love sort of both prongs of Rock of Ages, where we're dealing with, again, Lex's corporate takeover, this whole idea of, what is it? Kind of isolating the figureheads, right? They get Superman and Martian Manhunter on that decoy satellite, headhunting the young hotshots. We get, Cersei intervening with Connor and Kyle, and, Connor seemingly being tempted, right? To the point where he goes to Lex and he's like, I'll help you, like, as long as you don't hurt anybody. And of course, well, I guess this is an instance of Batman, always being very far ahead, where he has multiple, he's paid off Mirror Master. Mm-hmm. Right. Of course, Connor hasn't truly turned. And then we find out that Plastic Man has taken out the Joker and is impersonating him. So it all comes together very nicely.
Yeah. It's really just such a fun run. It's highly recommend anybody to read that one. That I think we covered it in more detail in the other episode, but I can't sing its praises enough.
It really is great. One line that stood out this time was, I think it's Superman, right, who says, sort of chastises Bruce for paying off McCullough, Mirror Master. It's like, he's a mercenary. You paid him. And Bruce is like, he's, all the money is going to the restoration fund for the orphanage he grew up in. He's like, never underestimate the sentimentality of a Scotsman.
Yeah.
Which a nice, a nice bit coming from Morrison.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I wrote down here that it feels like everyone's first day on the job always. Like that same chaotic energy is throughout this entire run. Like you felt it like being at a job for the first time and like you're getting stuff thrown at you all the time, and this whole run feels like the worst first day on the job at all times.
That is a great way of putting it, actually. I think that does capture the feeling of a lot of this. And in fairness, it's always a new threat that they're coming up against, right? Yeah. And it always seems to catch them off guard, and they're always up against the ropes before they rally. So they do always hit those same beats, but there's still always such a joy to watch play out. And again, it's just like I said, the scope of this, where we begin Rock of Ages with these hard light holograms, these evil, corrupted counterparts of the JLA, the Revenge Squad. And again, I mean, like, this could have been the basis for its own arc, but again, it's only this small piece, because we have an evil, corrupted version of Metron, as we find out, sending Kyle, Arthur, and Wally on this journey through space and time to find the Philosopher's Stone, which of course Lex has had in his possession all along. And prior to them ultimately correcting the timeline here, what would have happened is Superman would apprehend Luthor, destroy the Philosopher's Stone, and this would then allow Darkseid to come to Earth and seize power. And that's the future that our trio ultimately arrive in. We were talking off mic. I was saying, I was reading this and it was unclear to me exactly why the destruction of the Philosopher's Stone would allow Darkseid to come to power, and it's not said explicitly. The only thing I could think of is that could have been used to stop him, and then absent that, he has a clear path. Is there anything else that you've ever kind of pondered on that note?
No. Did you notice it in use anywhere? Like, did you during the finale? During World War III, did you notice it in use? Is it representative of the cosmic key that Prometheus is using potentially?
I mean, I really couldn't say. No,
that's the only thing I would say is the cosmic key kind of has a similar pattern to the Philosopher's Stone when it's in its raw form. So I'm unsure. It doesn't pop up. It's not very clear, but I mean, the way that everything else is seated throughout this, I don't think maybe it's something. I would say that the fault's maybe on me versus the writer at this point.
I'm sure there's something we're missing. I mean, I know the Warlogog, right? It does come back in 1 million, and that's what Our Man uses in part to help resurrect Lois Lane in the far future. So I mean, it comes up again. But yeah, I mean, as far as again exactly how its destruction would pave the way for Darkseid, I'm not entirely clear. But in any event, I'll go with it. And look, when we're in that future sequence, I mean, you get to see the fulfillment of the threat that Darkseid always presents. It's like, this is what would happen if he takes over the Earth. People are, sent up to the moon to be processed and to be, sort of bombarded with this anti-life equation. It takes away their free will and their hope and all of that. And of course, we have a ragtag bunch of freedom fighters and, Connor Hawke and Ray Palmer. I mean, they get some great moments. Batman, as always, falls to the Omega beams. It's, we talked about this last time, but it's that's an absolute, I guess, when you have one of these Morrison-written Darkseid time.
Poor Kyle's always getting changed into something. In any of these apocalyptic things, he's always having to be transformed into. This time he's halfway to being a parademon.
I know. Well, I love when we get to Crisis Times 5 when he's in the 5th dimension with Captain Marvel, and he's and Kyle, thinks to himself, he's like, why am I always sent into these other worlds, other dimensions? But yeah, that bit of meta self-awareness was pretty funny there. I like that.
Yeah. But, I wanted so much more detail in issue 10. I just loved, everything about, or was it 11? I forget. But whatever, Kyle's time in that and Wonder World and all of that. I just wanted so much more of that. I wanted to, more about all of those aspects. And I think that every like page in that could have been its own story. It's just one of those great comics.
You would want more of that. See,
I
that's
know.
that's the difference between us. I was like, I'm good. I probably could have done with a few less pages of that. For me, I was good, but I could definitely, I like that totally tracks. Like I'm sure you would enjoy that.
I would love a 12-part series of Kyle's 3 months in in his mind.
So they come out, and again, look, folks, if you want more talk on Rock of Ages, again, we did that whole other episode, so I don't want to make it sound like we're barreling through it, but we did do more thorough coverage of it in an earlier episode. So from there, we get to this 2-parter, right? Because at the end of Rock of Ages, Superman is like, we're officially disbanding the Justice League. They've been warned by Metron, the real good Metron, that you are merely forerunners, prepare for the fortification of the earth. And like they're told that this larger threat is looming. And so they end up disbanding, but then very shortly thereafter coming back together with an expanded roster.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I remember as a kid reading the end of Rock of Ages, and like when he says the JLA is officially disbanded, I was like, wait, what? And this is the last issue and all of that. Like it really, again, for a kid reading this at the time, it definitely had my attention. And then we get the new members. So, I mean, I guess just big picture, and as far as the new members that we're talking about, Steel, Huntress, Plastic Man, Oracle, their secret member, Barda and Orion, who they don't really have a choice about, but they sort of thrust themselves upon the league, and Zoriel. So we go from 7 to 14. What were your thoughts on the new members?
Oh, I loved it. I think having Huntress come along, especially with where she was in comics at that time, she was one of my favorites when I was a kid. To have her be there to be able to like witness like what Batman sees as like non-lethal heroism is like a really brilliant for her arc. And then Steel deserves it. I mean, Steel is a power player. He is up there with he's like everyone's like Forge almost from like the X-Men. He's that guy who can bring the tech and the understanding of that to a group. I feel like gotta have your engineer.
Well, what's interesting with the Huntress, I agree with everything you said, but when we get to the end of World War III, we leave, like her arc in this ends with her in the ghost zone with Prometheus, right? And she's about to kill him. Yeah. And Batman intervenes and he's like, your membership is revoked.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it. Did that feel appropriate to you as an ending for her and her arc and all of this?
Yeah. I mean, Batman can always be visualized as kind of an emotionally abusive, parental figure, at times, sometimes actually abusive when he backhands Robin in the All-Star, but
makes him eat rats.
I think, yeah. But I think that, he has his code and he will never break it. And if people don't fit into that, they're not a part of his world. He doesn't want to even acknowledge them. I think at that point, he basically gives her the cold shoulder from that point on. And it's Nightwing that's the only one that sees any redeeming qualities in her. And I remember her feeling terrible after that. And like in her arc, she like kind of even went a little bit more brutal. And then her and Dick Grayson kind of have this moment where he's like, listen, you know how dad can be. like...
Yeah. I mean, I think it certainly tracked for me, and as far as the Batman of it all, I guess the Huntress of it all is where, I don't know. I mean, it probably was realistic. Maybe it would have been a little too naive to think that, she's, just kind of going to change who she is. Right. But
I don't think there was anything that showed her that you didn't need to be lethal, especially with someone like Prometheus. Like, it's once again that Superman question that I've changed my opinion on at the end with Zod. Like, Prometheus, if she did kill Prometheus there, then what happened in that terrible run where Prometheus was Ollie and masquerading as Ollie would never have happened later on.
Oh, wait a minute. where Arsenal goes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that was okay. Gotcha.
Without if Huntress had killed him, we would never have had that.
I'm with Huntress then.
I know that's I'm 100% with Huntress.
Oh, that was a rough run. Yeah, I remember that whole
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. Okay. As far as this expanded membership, again, very, and obviously this came before, but very reminiscent of what we would see down the line on the Justice League Unlimited animated series, where
Yeah.
they expand their ranks. And what I love about this is, the characters they pick for us as fans of the characters, like, of course it makes sense, but on paper, I just think these were very interesting picks, right? Like, yes, as someone who's following the Superman books and loves Steel, of course I want Steel there. But at the same time, if they had gone with, and off the top of my head, I'm hard pressed to think of like, oh, who would have been sort of a bigger name, so to speak,
Yeah.
or something like that. But I loved how these picks, you saw the strategy involved, right, in terms of who they brought in, what they all brought to the table, and the fact that they were, characters who didn't have their own books for the most part. Right. And I think that gives you a little bit more freedom. And I think it really helped round out the team. I really, I was a big fan of this expanded lineup and a big fan of Prometheus. Did you get a chance to read that New Year's Eve special that gave his backstory? I thought, what'd you think of that?
So good.
Yeah.
And like Morrison was able to fit his own like parents' backstory in too, because his parents were like 60s revolutionaries that were like breaking into like nuclear facilities to like spray paint and like protest them. So like he was able to kind of like take his own origin story and like twist it for evil.
Oh, I didn't even know that backstory.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes me like it even better. Yeah.
It's so good. I loved Prometheus as a character, which is, you know what I mean, another underutilized character, I feel like, because after this he does not touched until that Green Arrow run, or what I think it was like the Cry for Justice. Yeah, I don't think he was really around until that.
That Cry for Justice thing. Look, I love James Robinson. He's in my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country. He has a great moment. Every time we have a screening of that thing, he gets a big laugh. Love the guy. I've loved a lot of his work.
Me too.
That Cry for Justice miniseries, they didn't need to take it so literally. I mean, it was like page after page of characters literally saying, like, justice.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I want to retouch that one at some point. I want to kind of dive in and learn more about it, because it was like such a visceral reaction from fans, and like I remember it was one of the things that I remember not enjoying, and Prometheus played such a huge part of that. And I love this character from these two issues. He, the end of his first issue, he beats up Batman and throws him like he's nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They set him up. When you think about, look, how hard it is to introduce a new character, a new villain or otherwise, but to really introduce a character that makes that kind of impression and that feels like they can go toe to toe, especially even with just one of these characters, let alone the entire JLA. And I think Morrison was able to accomplish that. It was cool. This was the first time I had finally read that New Year's Evil special that gave us Prometheus's origin, because sort of the setup for this is that the JLA has invited the press to the moon to unveil the new lineup, and there's this contest winner, right? Someone who like created a superhero costume and backstory, Retro Man, right? And he's going to be going up there, but Prometheus kills this guy and takes his place. And when you read just the JLA issues, he mentions, like, you see Retro Man and then you find out that it's actually Prometheus, but you don't see any of the lead up to that. So that New Year's Eve special, filled in some gaps, and obviously gave us the Prometheus backstory, everything you're saying with his parents being these outlaws who were, go out in a blaze of glory.
Tibet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it tied a lot together. But, did you watch Chuck by any chance?
No, I didn't, but I've heard good things.
It's a great show, the old NBC series. But in that, the main character, Chuck Bartowski, he is implanted with this intersect in his head that allows him to download information and then later physical skills. And that's, as I was, look, it always comes back to TV for me, Supernatural, Chuck. But as I'm reading this again, like what Prometheus is able to do with those discs, where, he can sort of download, all of these martial arts skills into his central nervous system, again, just felt very, very much like the intersect from Chuck.
Yeah. And it also, I think this also predates The Matrix, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Well, what was Matrix? Yeah, I think you're right.
99. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like those ideas coming from comics.
I know that was pretty cool, and yeah, to see him beat Batman with all these martial arts abilities, and he takes over Steel's armor. He's instructs him to walk as far as he can, and then throw the hammer. And of course, it's only Plastic Man that is able to to stop the hammer and help.
I
turn
love
the tide.
Plastic Man in this. Like he's not as humorous as you would think, but he adds this element of humor. But he's useful. He's not. He's very useful. I think this Prometheus run is like a masterclass on introducing a villain. Like how I was talking about, like Aztec, tragic and all of this. If you want to like introduce a great heel character, a great villain type, like you gotta have him beat the toughest guy all around, and he comes in and he wrecks the Justice League. And of course, like as a kid, you're gonna be like, "Oh, this guy is crazy," or "Oh man, this guy is so cool. He's so strong." Like, those aspects that kids look for, it's going to connect with them. And I think it's genuinely a masterclass on introducing a villain. It's very similar to what Hush does and why Hush was so well liked. He shows up and he orchestrates this whole thing around Batman and incorporates all of his villains and all of that, even though it's Riddler, I guess. But but you connect that with Hush, just like with Prometheus. It's this beautiful takedown of the Justice League that cements him as a real villain of them.
And the fact that he's ultimately taken down by a whip to the balls by Catwoman. It's great. It's great. Who had been impersonating Cat Grant. Like it's great.
The cat within the cat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, it's good stuff. Funny little bits too, like at the beginning of that two-parter where Martian Manhunter is shapeshifting into Clark Kent because Clark has also been invited up to the moon, right?
Yeah.
And he's still calling Lois Miss Lane, and she's like, "You got to call me Lois. They're going to think our marriage is in ruins." It's like little touches like that. Yeah. I really appreciate it. Oh, I neglected to mention this when we were talking about the end of Rock of Ages, but just as far as the Superman of it all in this, it's just one page, but I love the scene at the end of Rock of Ages between Superman and Lex, where Electric Superman, teleports into Lex's office. And, the whole thing there was that the Superman Revenge Squad had caused a number of civilian deaths during their first attack. And Lex, at the climax of Rock of Ages, actually uses the Philosopher's Stone to essentially undo that, right? And it allows him to get away with it, right? Like, what are you going to arrest him for? No one actually died. But, Superman has this moment with him where he's like, I think there's good in you, right? Batman thinks you just did this to get away with it. But like, I think you wanted to, undo those deaths. I think there's a good man in there. And Lex is like, yeah, you would think that, wouldn't you? And I like that back and forth, that one page. And it was, I thought it was very effective.
Yeah, I think so too. I genuinely love those interactions. It's like the perfect epilogue to always have for those two.
I know. Whether it's Superman, and this is a little twist on the typical Superman floating outside the window. Right now, he can just kind of beam himself in. So from here, we go to there's a 4-part fill-in. I don't want to say fill-in. But 4 issues guest written by Mark Waid, which again we didn't read specifically for this. During those issues, classic Red and Blue Superman rejoins the team. So we're now out of the Electric era at this point. And we get this 2-parter with Sandman and again Starro the Conqueror. And Starro had played a role in that JLA Secret Files and Origins issue. Yep. Right before the JLA had, fully officially formed. They had taken over the town of Blue Valley, Nebraska, where Wally is from. And Spectre, right, had wanted them to sort of, kind of let events play out, because if they could intervene and then the JLA get taken over, that could just be an absolute disaster. And the workaround there is that the JLA have Spectre remove their powers, right? So even if they are taken, they won't be able to cause as much damage. And of course, they save the day. But now we have everyone except Blue Valley and the JLA, basically everyone who had already encountered Starro. They remain awake, but everyone else is asleep and they're trapped in this dream and everything. Real quick, let me just say that Secret Files and Origins issue, I don't remember what it was called, but on Central Avenue in Hartsdale, New York, there was a stationery store, and it's like there's an H Mart there now next to it. It's like where KB Toys used to be on Central Avenue. Yeah. It was like next to that strip. But anyway, I remember being in the stationery store and seeing JLA Secret Files and Origins #1. And again, I'm a little kid at this point. I don't know. And I remember asking the cashier, I'm like, is this the first issue of the series? Like, I thought it was JLA #1.
Yeah.
And of course the guy was like, yeah, it's #1. And it wasn't, right? It's just a separate one shot. Maybe that I was expecting too much. But I always remember that issue because I always remember like having it and thinking that it was the first issue and then realizing that it wasn't. But anyway.
Well, those were always so cool when you had like the character breakdowns of like their abilities. I love those Secret Files when I was younger.
Same.
Now I was just like, yeah, I know. Like, just like those are the pages that I like glanced and skipped through. But
now going back, so again, that Secret Files issue gives us the background, the backstory with this version of Starro. But now we get into this two-parter here, JLA 22 and 23 with Sandman. I have to confess, as much as I know it's a classic, everyone reveres it, I have still not read Sandman, so Daniel appearing didn't do as much for me, but I definitely recognized the importance of it. But I know it resonated more with you.
No, it was really cool because I had no concept of what Sandman was when I was younger, and now that I'm a fan of it, it was cool to see him because I didn't know if he was ever utilized again, because he's kind of at the very end of Sandman kind of takes over in a sense, and it was very interesting to see a character that I thought I didn't realize how much Sandman interacts with the DC universe outside of, that one Death issue. And I'm starting to notice more and more that a lot of the Vertigo stuff did cross over more than I had initially realized. So that was cool to me. I'm sure you're on Mike San Gregorio's good list now because he can't stand Sandman.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I joke around with him about it.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, again, you two are among the biggest Morrison fans I know, and you guys seem pretty similarly aligned on a lot of stuff. But so he's not a Sandman fan.
Not a Sandman guy.
All right. I do. I mean, at some point I will at least try. But yeah, I mean, it was still cool to see the character utilized, and obviously I appreciated the role that Superman played in all of this, right? Where there's this one boy, Matthew Haney, right, in this dream world who, knows that something's not right and like can half remember Superman, but can't quite get all the way there. And so Superman and Kyle and Wonder Woman, right? Those are the three who go into the dream world, and sort of that belief in Superman is able to help them, turn the tide. So it was nice. And then, when everyone wakes up and you find out that Matthew Haney is not a little kid, right, but is this, adult homeless person on the street. And then you see Daniel kind of walking away and he's got this like hat full of gold at the end. Oh, this was a nice payoff.
It was really cool. And I mean, that's everyone's dream, right? That we're kind of stuck in the world without Superman, but we'll wake up and there we are in like this more interesting Superman world. It's kind of where a lot of comic book people think about, deeply sometimes. We all kind of want that more interesting life sometimes. But at the same time, do we really want to deal with crises every day? We have our own small crises. I would much rather that than world-ending ones all the time.
For sure. I will also say, Starro, right? So iconic and so, hand in hand when you think Justice League. And I thought this was a cool take, beyond just the typical star on the face mind control, but the whole dream aspect I thought was a cool touch to add to it.
I love Starro, and I actually watched that Starro scene from the James Gunn Suicide Squad again, and it's the silliest of characters and one of the most terrifying concepts as well. I think it kind of manages to be both of those things. Something about Sandman that I think you might want to touch on at some point, even if it's like a one-off like thing. There's an issue where all of the elder gods of DC are basically having a meeting before like the Big Bang, almost, in a sense, and Rao is there, and so like Superman's deity is there like at this meeting, like talking about like what his views of the universe would be, and he's kind of this embodiment of Superman as well.
Oh, interesting. And that's and where is that?
It's in Sandman, so it's like
Okay.
later in one of the like later issues of Sandman. It's just
All right.
something I thought you might find interesting.
All right. I'll have to check that out at a minimum, at least that. So from
Yeah.
there, we go to this 3-part Ultramarine Corps storyline where we have this new team who seemingly got their powers when they encountered this other dimension, but it turns out that's bogus. That's a cover story concocted by General Wade Eiling, and in fact, this team, was genetically altered, and they're not going to last long. And Eiling himself has created this plan to transplant his consciousness from his own body into the body of the Shaggy Man, who's quickly shaved, gets a new
I
look.
love that.
But we have essentially this rogue military unit waging war against the Justice League, and what I liked about this more than anything was just how taken aback the Justice League are. I mean, kind of like what you were saying, it's always like the worst first day. But again, this too is a new wrinkle. This isn't some external threat. These aren't alien invaders. It's like their own government, right?
Yeah.
Even though they're going against the president and everything. But I mean, I thought it was cool just to kind of get their reactions, their shock and horror at everything. What was your take on this arc?
I wasn't the biggest fan of this arc, but I think it plays an important role in the overall story because it's so at home. The Justice League of America, the JLA, they are the heroes for this country. And in this comic book series, they've kind of taken on a more international and cosmic and scale. So, of course, a natural reaction to that would be the United States government being like, well, we need to get new nukes, since the other ones are doing whatever they want. And so it's a logical like point to have in this run, and it's also a foil to the next arc, which is completely like wonky and crazy and fifth dimensional. So you have this one that's very, very much based and grounded on Earth and in reality, versus the arc that follows, which is kind of out in other dimensions.
That is a great point. And it also establishes Eiling as the general, right? This shaved, shaggy man, and he'll become part of the next iteration of the Injustice Gang in World War III. So he gets them set up for that, and he's teleported to this asteroid belt at the end of the story, and that's where we pick up with him later. So there's some good setup there. But no, that is a great point. And it's funny. So again, I guess going back to sort of our frame of reference at the time, this series is called JLA.
Yeah.
And yes, we know what it stands for, but it's called JLA. It's not called Justice League of America like all the other iterations before and since, or even if it was Justice League Europe or Justice League International. You had that context like right in the title here. And it's funny because we had this, and then very shortly thereafter we had JSA. So, there's this whole stretch, again, for both of us, like a very formative early time, and it's JLA and JSA. And it's only kind of what came after, and then taking a step back and looking what came before, you realize that was an outlier. And I wonder, and I'm sure this maybe has been, spoken about at some point in some interview, but I'm curious like what the rationale was for calling this JLA. Was it, to your point, because the stories were going to kind of take on such a cosmic biblical scale that Justice League of America kind of felt too small? Like, I wonder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I that's what I would assume, but I don't know all the details on that. I know that it's a very easy way to get away from that, and so it recalls, but is also new sounding, so it's very good branding, I think, because everybody calls them the JLA or the JSA. It's not the Justice Society or the Justice League as much as I think amongst fans and people inside, it's JLA, JSA.
For
I think it was a brilliant rebranding.
Well, so speaking of JSA, yeah. We get this 4-part Crisis Times 5 arc where we meet JJ or Jakeem Thunder, right, who is in possession of the what we'll come to learn is the pink genie from the fifth dimension, formerly the Thunder, known as the Thunderbolt, as part of the JSA. And this brings the JLA into contact with the surviving members of the Justice Society of America: Alan Scott, Ted Grant, Jay Garrick, Hippolyta. And I was thinking about this. I mean, other than what I saw of them in Zero Hour briefly, right, in that mid-90s event, I mean, this was really like my true introduction to the JSA, and this was so close. I mean, the JSA relaunch, led by Goyer, James Robinson, Jeff Johns, came pretty shortly thereafter this, like within the next year or so.
Yeah.
So this like really teed that up, and was very much kind of how I got to know these characters. I've always looked back on this fondly, because this got me, it's funny, like thinking back on it. Yeah, I don't know, would I have been as interested in that relaunch had I not read this? Probably not. So I do credit this with a lot, because I was a huge fan of that series.
I think I was lucky because around this time period, anything Kyle Rayner I would pick up, and there was this mini series. I think I forget who drew it. I got to look it up again. I don't remember a lot about it outside of like the feelings I had connected with it, because it's kid memories. And it was Kyle and Alan and Wally and Jay, and it was just the four of them in this like little mini series that I had read. And it was like Jay teaching Kyle, and sorry, other way around, Alan teaching Kyle and Jay teaching Wally. And it was just this really cool like grandpa and grandson story. So it was really something that I had connected with, and that was my introduction to the JSA. And then this obviously built on that, so I already had idea of who the Sentinel and Jay Garrick Flash were.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff in here. We get, so again, we had this Thunderbolt in the Justice Society of America. I mean, to my knowledge, people correct me if I'm wrong, I think this was the first time that it was established that it was a fifth dimensional being, a la Nexus Pitalik.
Yep.
And we have this war between the pink Thunderbolt and the blue one, and then ultimately they'll kind of combine into purple at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But along the way, we have Captain Marvel intervening. When he knocks out Superman with that punch, that was not my favorite. Yeah, that was not my favorite part of all of this, but it's fine.
Oh, you don't like that his magic punch took out your guy?
Not my favorite, but it's okay. He had to give Captain Marvel something to do. I get it. It's okay.
I wonder what that says. Does that mean that if they got into a real serious fight, that Superman would be on the ropes there?
I think Superman would be all right. We've seen enough instances where he could get one over. It's all right. But this is what I think you were referring to earlier, where Spectre is imprisoned, and there's this whole world that's building up around him, and Zariel and Sentinel have to figure out how to free Sentinel or free Spectre without killing everyone and everything on this world. And so they accelerate the life cycle of the planet. It is really cool, right?
That's so like Star Trek-y and so cool. I just love that. That's like, though I love those high concepts like that are tragic and beautiful all the same.
Yeah, that was a really cool bit. We also find out that Ted Grant, Wildcat, has 9 lives.
He stood out so much in this to me. Like, I remember, like, I've always loved Wildcat, and I think this might have been why I have always loved Wildcat, because he was just so cool in all of this.
Yeah, he was. No, it was really cool. Like, it was great to meet them in this way. And again, now in a reread, to sort of see this early step, right, in what would be the ultimate reformation of the Justice Society. So it was, that was a fun one. And again, I do credit Howard Porter with this, because this whole extended sequence where Kyle and Captain Marvel are in the fifth dimension, and they're, I mean, I can't even describe it, but it's I feel like in lesser hands it could have become like this jumbled mess, but I really felt like I was on board for their part of the story there.
Yeah, and I have to, thank Our Man for moving the story along at one point. I've never seen a moment so clear when a writer has like walked themselves into a situation that they don't know how to get out of, and then they like insert something to just move it along. It was so clear that Morrison was like, I need to get out of this. Why did I write this scene? And then you see just at the end, like, Our Man being like, all right, this is going to take forever. This is going to be useless. And he transports them midway through the speech. I think it's just a brilliant transition.
It was. And of course, this Our Man from the 853rd century was sort of coded with, Rex Tyler's DNA. So they had that connection point. It was, look, this will probably be another kind of episode at some point down the line. I won't belabor the point here, but this was this whole stretch in the DCU the late 90s into the early to mid 2000s, when you had the JLA and the JSA side by side, and you really got to see um, the dynamic and the function that each one can serve, and they were distinct, and it was such a fun time. Anyway,
Yeah,
I know the
I agree.
JSA is getting some play again now, but they had been off the board for so long. But and with that, we get into Morrison's final farewell arc, World War III, which brings all of these threads together. So, like we had said before, we have another attack by the Injustice Gang. This time, it's Lex, it's Prometheus, it's General Eiling, and it's Queen Bee. But we also have now the final arrival of Mageddon, this the weapon of the old universe that is again increasing everyone's aggression across the world and causing all of these conflicts, and will ultimately result in the annihilation of everything. So I mean, this was big. This was a lot of moving parts, a lot of characters. I mean, what I don't know. Just I mean, we can unpack it as more specifically, but just big picture. How did you feel this served as the culmination of Morrison's work on this title?
I think it was a great endpoint. He could have ended with Rock of Ages, and I would have been happy with this run. But we got more, and that's great. And I think that this kind of takes in everything that was built up before, even the stuff from like the Secret Origins, and getting more Prometheus always is fantastic. And I like that, Batman wanted to kind of have some vengeance on him. And there's like really, it feels like a great series finale.
Yes.
Like it has, like, if this was a TV show and this was the show that we got over a few seasons or one season, I would be so satisfied with this ending.
I agree. Big surprise. I also put it in television terms, but I felt the same way. Like it really had that feeling of all of these threads coming together, right? Because and that's the benefit, I think, of how Morrison seeded all of this throughout, where we've been told for so long about why Barda and Orion and even Zariel were there. And it's like, okay, now we get to see all of this come to a head. And I did like the structure of it, where we start with the more, tangible, I guess, threat of the Injustice Gang,
Yep.
right? And they've, they're detonating explosives on the watchtower and all of this. But then we have this larger threat that we've been building to all along, which essentially just this embodiment of evil,
Yep.
right? That is going to require everyone coming together. And I mean, I don't know. I guess people's mileage on something like Mageddon will vary because, right, it's a device, right?
Yeah.
Not a character. But I think I think it works.
Yeah, I mean, it's meant to represent something bigger than Darkseid, which is why I think it was left so ambiguous. Because you can't characterize something like that too much. You can't even give it a voice, really, because it needs to be something that would, just kind of roll over Apocalypse in a sense. And you get that. I mean, it's bigger than I think anything's ever been drawn on page as well. When they put it up against Earth, it's massive on the page. You usually see some space there, but they made sure to make that there's no space. It's just this giant eye looking at Earth. And that, that eye also popped up in a prior issue with Kyle, and then he knows how to deal with it, and he's the one who uses Lex's ego to kind of get him out of it too, which is an awesome scene. And like, that's Kyle knows how to handle these things. He is now a veteran member in a sense by this issue.
I know, it was great. He's like, you always say you're smarter than everyone, Luthor. Like, now's your chance to prove it. Like, it's great.
You're losing to an eyeball. Like,
and then of course Lex, even as he's coming out from under the thrall of this thing, he still doesn't miss a beat. He's like, I basically, like, I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I was under its control. Like, he's already, extricating himself from any legal culpability. So
what was the line he says at one point? Like, allegedly I was involved with the Injustice Gang or something.
Right. Yeah, he has a line. I think he's talking to Prometheus, and there's a great line. I forget what the exact quote was, but he's talking about the Joker, and he said something like, he's frighteningly appalling, but like oddly compelling company. Something in that spirit, as Luthor's describing Joker.
I also love the interaction where he's like, "Would you win an award for writing poetry when you were younger?" Like, just
I know. And yeah, Batman gets his revenge on Prometheus. He, I guess, overwrites the disc that Prometheus is downloading into his nervous system and replaces all of the martial artists with Professor Stephen Hawking.
I read that, and I like just like was sitting next to Christina, and I show it to her, and she's like, "Oh," and I was like, "Yeah," and we were both kind of like, "Oh," like this is what he did. They just very, I guess Batman's vengeance holds no bars.
No. Yeah, but again, going back to this whole idea of series finale, right? Like
Yeah,
he had gotten his ass kicked by Prometheus a few arcs before, and now, and now we get the payoff to that. So it was great. Unsurprisingly, it pleased me greatly that so much of this came down to Superman in the heart of Mageddon.
yeah,
Initially overtaken by the darkness and the despair, and the fact that so much of this came down to Batman talking Clark through Bruce talking Clark through it
yeah,
is always great, right? Because so much of the DCU just hinges on these two, and kind of everything extends outward from them. So to have such a big piece of this come down to the two of them was great. I texted this to you before we recorded because it's funny. We're recording this, and people are going to hear this very, very shortly after the 2-year anniversary of the release of Zack Snyder's Justice League.
yeah,
And there's a moment at the end of the first trailer, and of course, a moment in the movie that's a favorite of mine, where Barry's like, Steppenwolf, like he's faced hundreds of thousands of these beings on other worlds, and he's always won. It's like, what chance do we have? And Bruce says, I don't care how many demons he's fought and how many hells, he's never fought us, not us
yeah,
united. And you can imagine how delighted I was as I'm reading Morrison's World War III and Superman struggling against the thrall of Mageddon. And Bruce says telepathically, I don't care if it can destroy every god in every heaven, Clark. It never faced us before.
yeah,
I mean, Snyder read his Morrison.
yeah. He definitely did, and it's a testament to those two characters. Without Batman acting as Bruce, like acting as his more empathetic side, he wouldn't have been able to get through to Superman, and the darkness would have overcome. But the darkest person who has faced all of these dark things is able to know how to reach the light, and that's the yin yang of the DC universe. There is those two.
I know. I love at one point where he says to Clark, he's like, I can't believe I'm having to tell this to you.
Yeah.
But it's great. And, Superman's able to break free, and he realizes that, because it's essentially this dark sun, right, within Mageddon. And he's like, I can absorb sunlight. My cells are solar batteries. So it stands to reason I can absorb, anti-sunlight as well. And he's able to do that. And as he says, Doomsday is canceled until further notice. But there was a moment before that actually made me tear up, where you had mentioned before about Animal Man, right? Animal Man, recognized some early signs of the increased aggression, right, in the animal world. And he realized that Mageddon was stimulating the reptilian parts of people's brains, right? And that's what was leading to this increased hostility. And so he and Wonder Woman and some of the others, right, they come up with this whole plan to try to kind of like block that ray that's coming from Mageddon to the people of Earth. And they ultimately temporarily turn the population of Earth into superhumans.
Yeah.
For a moment. And we get this scene where, and it's, if you look at the cover to JLA 41, that's sort of what it reflects. You see everyone kind of like flying toward it, and I think it's Oracle is like, what's going on? And Wonder Woman says, like, I couldn't talk the people out of it. Like, they all said Superman saved them so many times, they're going to try to do whatever they can.
Yeah.
And it made me tear up. I've used the analogy of It's a Wonderful Life a bunch of times, but this is another instance where it's like he has saved everybody so many times over, and they had a chance to repay him, and they took it. And I'll wrap this up because we just passed the 2-hour mark. But there's something we've talked about in the past. The late, great Tim Sale, he had an issue of that Solo series, the artist-centric title. And in that, he and Jeff Loeb did sort of a lost chapter that would fit in between Superman for All Seasons. And it's this whole sequence of how Clark is on his way to the prom, and then he sees a neighbor whose car is broken down in the mud, and he goes to help her, and then he gets like covered in mud, and she just drives off. But Martha's telling the story, and she's like, Clark helps people the way he can because he does what he assumes other people would do if they were able to, right? Like that's like for him, he's just able to do more, but he does what he thinks other people would do. And like, this is an opportunity and it's an instance where it's like his faith in people is rewarded. It's like they are now in a position temporarily to help in the way that he does, and they take it. And I just love that. I thought that was such a beautiful moment.
It is, and there's a lot of these stories in this time period that kind of can like go right into one another. You can kind of like end this run and then just go and pick up Kingdom Come, and it'll make perfect sense. Like, because like that's the world that they were left with. Everybody was super powered. The JSA and JLA were kind of combined, and then now you have Kingdom Come. It like kind of leads perfectly into it.
Actually, that's a big picture question I wanted to ask you, because I know we're talking about how, it reflects what was going on in the books at the time and all of that. But in terms of this run's timelessness, how timeless do you find it?
Fairly so. I think the even though I wasn't the biggest fan of the Ultramarines segment, I think it kind of fits where we're heading towards right now, this kind of increased aggression and building up towards potential war, which I know is not the lightest of topics to cover, but it's kind of why comic books exist in the first place, was to get kids through war, in a sense, to get them understanding it, to get them potentially to see the side of peace and truth and justice more than just blatant warfare. And I think that is what makes this timeless. It's ultimately about this ultra war that's occurring and humanity having to find peace within themselves to push back against the idea of war and why it happens.
I'm with you. Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, right, like for us, there is that heavy nostalgia factor. And like I said, I read this and it took me right back to when I was reading it the first time. But I don't think that undercuts the timelessness of it. I really do think that this is something that, again, I think there's a reason why you can continue to give this run to someone and it will work. And yeah, in this final arc, I mean, just so many great moments, a lot of which we've already touched on. But, Zariel dying, going to heaven, rallying the angels, coming back down to Earth. Orion finally, getting his chance to unleash his astro force on Mageddon. I mean, Orion's a lot of talk, not a ton of results, but
yeah,
still always entertaining. Wonder Woman and Flash and Animal Man, again, coming up with this plan to turn the population into superheroes. Kyle overcoming the interference of Mageddon and getting his ring to work again. I mean, there's just, and of course the Superman and Batman and Martian Manhunter of it all. It's a lot of great moments. And then we end with our core 7. Right. Yeah. Initially kind of talking about taking some time off, and then they get a call from Oracle about Dr. Destiny threatening to de-imagine Detroit. And our last line here where Superman's like, come on, Batman, we're the Justice League, you love it. And then you get them, charging into action. It's good stuff.
It's a fantastic run. It's, a testament to Grant's work. It is a great comic you can give to kids, you can give to people who are new to comics, you can give to people who, might have missed this at one point. And I think that anyone can kind of connect with these stories. There's not anything that's really dating it outside of maybe like MTV generation references every now and then. But that's, what the criticism of those characters were here. I think when they first popped up, people were like, oh, what is these MTV generations? So Morrison was just kind of putting that in there as kind of the, talking point.
I hope people enjoyed this episode. It's funny because, I don't love to do an episode where like we're just tearing something apart, because I don't take delight in that. No. But, most of what we talk about, there's stuff we like, there's stuff we didn't like. And, I think that makes it interesting. This is an instance where, again, like I don't really have many critiques. Like this was, but again, I really enjoyed the conversation. Again, I'm sure the audience did too, but it's just like, I don't know what to say other than it worked then, it works now. It was a tremendous delight to revisit and truly an all-time great run.
Absolutely.
So, we covered a tremendous amount of material in a fair amount of time here, but still, I know we didn't go through every issue, every beat. There's a lot we didn't talk about, but we talked about a lot of the big picture stuff and a lot of the specifics that really stood out. So, I love that we did this and it was so much fun, and I appreciate you rereading and coming along for the ride on this. Ralph, where do you want to direct people if they want to check out your music?
You can find me mostly on Instagram, just Instagram at Ralph Puma. You can find my music. You can find other things I'm working on. We're coming up on a 10-year anniversary for some little series that I made. So yeah, it's almost been 10 years, and there might be a entirely newly re-edited film bite-sized version of it. So we'll talk about that as time progresses.
How's that for a tease? Oh man, I did not realize it was 10 years. That's insane.
Yeah.
But that's very cool. I hope people will check out your stuff and follow you. I'm a fan and have been and will continue to be, and I hope people will check out your work as well. So Ralph, thank you very, very much. Audience, thank you for tuning in. As always, our electric Til 1 Million event continues next week. Next week, this is a special one, and it's a perfect follow-up to this episode. So next week, we're going to have a little bit of an interlude, and we have our Justice League animated mixtape episode. So this period, 97 to 99, Superman the Animated Series was running during this time, of course. Now, we've already covered Superman the Animated Series in a series of mixtapes that we did at the beginning of last year. But I wanted Superman the Animated Series to be represented in this run, right? Because it fits in this time period. So what Jeremy and I did, Jeremy was my guest for the Superman mixtapes, and he came back for this. We took a look at a selection of Superman-centric Justice League and Justice League Unlimited episodes. So we're talking about the continuation of Superman the Animated Series in Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. It's a really fun episode, and that'll be out next week. I hope you will all tune in and enjoy. As always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.